It was tedious work, but creepy as well, because under the peels were messages written by an obviously disturbed boy named Billy. Written in first person, Billy penned promises stating what he would and wouldn't do again, which both fascinated and concerned her because they involved the McDonald triad. Now it's time for Puppets, Pupils, and Producers, a story of mind over matter. While it was common for all patients to display a lack of insight, the patients on Unit 4 were different because their deflection and projection protected them from taking responsibility. Instead of looking in the mirror, they existed on a spectrum of obvious or hidden victimness, which was why everybody else was the problem, and they were not. Unlike some of the doctors and nurses, Cassie didn't believe that genetics played a role in the development of personality disorders. Instead, she thought they were nurtured into existence by their caregivers and the environment they grew up in. From Cassie's observations, the narcissist seemed determined to pretend their childhood hadn't affected them, while the sociopaths remained angry about it. One didn't want to admit he had flaws, while the other seemed determined to make everyone else pay for his imperfections. Everyone was responsible for his actions, except for him, which was why they either ran from or fought against their own self-mastery, which was also why they all shared the common belief that they did not belong there, and justified it by comparing themselves to the psychotic patients. They'd say they didn't hear voices, they weren't delusional, and they didn't need to take medication, which Cassie would nod in agreement to, and then say something like, "True, but you're comparing apples to oranges, because some patients have an illness that affects their brain, and some have an illness that affects their mind. And as we both know, there's no pill for an illness of the mind." To which the Unit 4 patient would then complain about the lack of therapies available to him, and then, depending on how long he'd been a patient there, would mention how he would have served his time by now had he gone to prison, which she'd also nod yes to before she'd respond that she wasn't involved in the decision that brought him there, but she would be involved in the decision about whether he left, so they should focus on that. It was the same conversation day after day. There was no talking about their remorse or regrets because nothing was their fault. Instead, they pretended that sitting in a circle jerk of devious minds, bragging about their offenses, was therapeutic. Some of the doctors and nurses genuinely believed they were helping them, while most privately thought they'd never change. Those who dared to suggest that prison might have taught them what it felt like to become an actual victim were usually transferred to another unit, or they were fired. Since she needed her job, Cassie talked to her supervisor about transferring to a unit with psychotic patients, but he didn't want to let her go, and because he knew she only came there because she was dealing with a difficult ex, he suggested she switch to night shifts, where she'd spend most of her time listening to them snoring instead of sniveling. She left her supervisor's office saying she'd have to think about it, which really meant she had to consider whether another legal battle with Rich would be worth it. Then she thought about how, with Sam's help, she wouldn't need a babysitter at all. She thought about how not having to pay $1,000 a month for their nanny, plus the extra shift premium, would help her qualify for a mortgage as well. Then she could buy another house, which would also solve the problem of needing to change Jackson's school. Moving closer to their work also meant that Sam would be closer to his kids, and it would cut his gasoline costs in half. Arguably, the person who it didn't benefit as much was Rich, because he'd have to do more driving. But he'd also have an extra $1,000 in his pocket every month, and surely no one but a soulless villain would argue that his children were better off with a nanny instead of their mother. But it wasn't a decision she could make lightly, because she knew the toll chronically lacking sleep could take, and she'd have to eat some legal crow if night shifts didn't work out, and they'd have to revert to needing a nanny. So Cassie spoke with Sam about her plan, and on their way home, they took a detour through a village that met all the criteria in her lengthy separation agreement, except for one, depending on who you asked. If you asked Rich, he'd say it was almost 2 kilometers over the limit because the measurement was based on driving. But if you asked Cassie, she'd say it was exactly 30 kilometers away from City Hall because it was not measured by road, but as the crow flies. Rich didn't like the changes. He also knew a judge wouldn't side with him unless there was a serious problem with the mother. So he called his new friend Darlene, and she told him all about Russell and how he was afraid of Cassie because she was a witch. Which wasn't even the worst of it, because according to her daughter Darla, she'd seen seances, sacrifices, and spell casting, all while Sam and Cassie apparently used copious amounts of cocaine around the children. Before Rich's newest letter of legal rhetoric arrived, Cassie and Sam found a century-old home with new windows, a partially finished addition, and a demolished lawn hiding construction waste under 3 feet of snow. While there was no denying it needed a lot of work, it didn't matter to the couple because it was surrounded by mature trees, there was a library around the corner, and the arena where Jackson would fulfill his father's dream of becoming a famous NHL player was at the end of the street. Everything she needed was within walking distance, and the people were a balanced blend of farmers and professionals who valued family and community. She thought it was perfect, so come hell or high water, she was going to make it happen. And so she did. They took possession of the house a month before they moved in, and used their vacation time to work on it while the kids were with their other parents. In the weeks leading up to their move, Sam finished the large sunroom and the bathroom and laundry room in the basement, while Cassie worked on the second floor, where the kids' bedrooms, a bathroom, and a guest room were located. During the first week, she sanded the paint off the wooden floors and stained them. Then she painted the bathroom and started working on removing several layers of wallpaper in what would become Russell's bedroom. It was tedious work, but creepy as well, because under the peels were messages written by an obviously disturbed boy named Billy. Written in first person, Billy penned promises stating what he would and wouldn't do again, which both fascinated and concerned her because they involved the McDonald triad, which linked childhood animal cruelty, persistent bedwetting, and fire setting to violent behavior in adults. Questions about Billy filled her head. She wondered if he was the adult son who'd started the renovations but spent the money on partying instead. Or maybe he was a boy who'd lived in the house before the last family sold it to her. whoever he was. She wanted to know how he'd turned out, so she made a mental note to ask their realtor the next time she spoke with him. Then the light went out. Cassie flipped a switch, but nothing happened. So she took the burnt bulb out and went hunting for the box containing the new ones. As she descended the creaky stairs, she thought about her children becoming teenagers one day and how they'd never be able to sneak up or down them. When she reached the landing, a strong smell of cigarette smoke wafted by. She yelled down to Sam to remind him that for the sake of the children, they'd agreed to stop smoking inside the house. But he didn't answer, so she went looking for him and found him trying to figure out the electrical box. Cassie prepared their lunch, and while they ate, she told Sam about the messages under the wallpaper, which sent him looking for his tool belt, where he retrieved 3 folding knives with the name Billy painted on them. Sam started to explain that Billy had carved messages in the wood in the basement, but they were startled by Ike, who came flying out of their bedroom, located right beside the kitchen. Cassie clutched her chest and laughed at their cat's bout of zoomies. Then she realized he'd found another marble and chased it down so she could put it in the kitchen drawer where it joined the others. The sound of the doorbell interrupted their lunch break. At their door, Cassie could see an elderly lady holding a container of welcome to the neighborhood cookies. After introducing herself as the woman who used to live there, Barbara shared that she was happy someone was fixing the place up and asked if she could look around at the changes they'd made. She shuffled when she walked and moved very slowly, but it was her trembling hands that made Cassie wonder whether she actually had Parkinson's disease or whether she was looking at drug-induced Parkinsonism from taking antipsychotic medication. They toured the upstairs, where she said she loved what Cassie had done to the floors and the color she'd chosen for the bathroom paint. Then she noticed the garbage bags full of wallpaper and started crying out.
Oh, with the blend. So much blood.
Sam overheard the woman's distress and started up the stairs to assist her. Once they got Barbara to the kitchen, they sat her down and asked if there was someone they could call to come and get her. She said no and left shortly after. 3 weeks later, Barbara stood on their doorstep again. This time she knocked loudly because, as Cassie would soon learn, Barbara believed she was still owed money. Cassie tried to convince her she needed to speak with her lawyer, but it had the opposite effect because the people at the bank told Barbara the same thing, so they were obviously all working together. When she started yelling at her, Cassie considered calling the police, but at the very same time, Rich pulled into the driveway with the kids. She had to get Barbara to leave, or she'd have to tell Rich that she bought a house from a deranged woman. But he already knew about the house and its reputation because Candy worked with someone who lived in the village, and it was big news that 2 psych nurses bought the suicide house on Baker Street. Hola, hola, peoples! If you're enjoying my fictional self-healing series, I'd love your feedback. I'd also love it if you'd feed the algorithm by following me and liking the post. And if you're stuck in the mindset and frequency of a puppet, and you'd like an energy session with me, please reach out and we'll make it happen.